Turn this on. There you go. So open our Bibles this morning to John 6:14. And while you're finding that, and I suspect you already know where that is, could you also find Mark 6:45? Just go back 2 books to the book of Mark 6:45. He gives us a couple of bits of information we want to kind of incorporate into what we're looking at this morning. Last week we looked at really what was the largest public miracle to date, largest in terms of the crowd, 15, maybe 1,000 folks who were there, had followed the Lord and his disciples into the wilderness, though the Lord had tried to take his boys away for some rest. The crowds were endless. They didn't have so much as time to eat, oftentimes we are told, and so as the crowds came and as the Lord began to lay out the message, we will see in this final year the crowds beginning to leave. And the reason is they have a different expectation of the Lord than he has of them. They want a political deliverer. They want God to meet their needs. They don't necessarily want to hear about sin and forgiveness and repentance and a Savior. And that's certainly true here in this chapter that's known for Jesus saying he is the bread of life. It's a long chapter. We're going to take several weeks to go through it. But you remember last week that the Lord early on said to the boys, and specifically to Philip, where are we going to get enough food to feed all these people? And we mentioned to you that because of the book of Mark's comments, that it does appear that Philip, who lived in the area, and the boys had all day to think about an answer. Because when evening had come, Mark records that they all said to Jesus kind of what Philip did, Lord, send them away. We can't feed these people. Specifically, the Lord said that evening to Philip, so where are we going to get food? And he said, well, that's really a math problem. 9 months worth of income will just feed everyone just a little. And they didn't learn what the Lord had wanted to teach them, which was very simply, when things couldn't be done by them, God was with them. He was able. Andrew, who was more resourceful, found a young man with some pita bread and some fish, and he said, but really that's not very much. Well, the Lord had these 15,000 folks sit down in groups of 50 and 100 according to Mark's gospel, and then after blessing the bread and fish, the apostles became waiters, and for the next several hours served everyone until not only they were full, they were glutted, is what the Greek tells us. They were just stuffed. It was free meal, and everyone was taking advantage. And then the Lord sent the boys down, and they collected 12 baskets of leftover bread, verse 13 here of John 6. And this morning we want to pick up the story there and look at the after effects of the miracle upon the crowd and upon his own, and what we have decided to call Storm Survival Guide. So let's start here at verse 14 this morning in John, where we read these words. Afterwards, I did it again, verse 14, my page keeps slipping. Then those men, when they had seen the sign that Jesus did, said, truly this is the prophet who is to come into the world. And therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and to take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself. And when evening was come, his disciples went down to the sea, and they got into a boat. They went over the sea towards Capernaum, and it was already dark, and Jesus had not come to them. And the sea arose because a great wind was blowing. The reaction of the crowd was certainly, I think, expected. They were jubilant. Imagine being fed like this and saying to yourself, well, this is the promised prophet. Moses had said back in Deuteronomy, one day there will be someone who comes just like me, who will deliver you. And you will hear his voice, and you will hear his words, and you will follow him all of your life. Now, Jesus was far more than just Moses, but the people in their mind said, well, we were in Egypt at the time Moses came. We were under the domination of the Romans now. Certainly, this is the one that's going to take us and deliver us. And yet, understand that nobody in the crowd, or few in the crowd, were saying, you know, I'm sinful and I need a forgiveness. They weren't aware of the darkness in their lives. They weren't aware of the love of God in sending his son. They were basically interested in a physical sort of deliverance. We want food when we don't have it. We want a powerful political leader. They weren't falling on their knees crying out for mercy. They were mobilizing, determined, these 15,000 folks to make him king by force. This is the time now. And it's a pretty dangerous time when 15,000 people get something into their minds. You know, that crowd mentality where people do things that they would never do on their own. And not only that, but their desire was not what God wanted at all. He didn't come for that now. He came to save. And so, though you may have heard them say, well, he's a good man, he's a prophet, we'll let him be king, understand that he is only allowed to be king as long as he does what they want. And that's a lot of ways, in many ways, the way people relate to God today. A lot of these folks will soon walk away. Well, in verse 45 of Mark 6, where you hopefully have your marker, we read these words, "Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side over to Bethsaida, while he sent the multitudes away. And when he had sent them away, then he departed to a mountain to pray. And when evening came, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone upon the land." Jesus' first move was to get rid of his disciples. They had come over on a boat. There were no other boats there. That was the only boat, we'll be told in a few weeks. But in any event, Jesus wanted to get these boys out of the crowd. Go back to Bethsaida or Capernaum, the other side where their headquarters or the home base of Jesus was, 8 miles across the water back to the other side. And Jesus wanted to get rid of them so he could then disperse the crowd. And when he did, he went up to pray by himself because there was a lot of political churning. In Mark 6:45, you read the words, he made them. The Lord made his disciples get into the boat. It's the word for constrain. It means to force against some kind of resistance. So what we learn is the disciples thought this was a great idea. They too wanted a political deliverer. They too hadn't quite understood fully why the Lord had come, but they were excited that 15,000 people are now chanting Jesus for president, right? Jesus, oh, this is going to be good. And the Lord said, get in the boat. Well, no, I want to stay. Just when it's get in the boat. And take those 12 baskets with you. And so they were forced, if you will, by the Lord out of harm's way. The Lord did not want them to getting caught up with this worldly idea of why he had come and what he should do. And think about the crowd. You know, Judah was a ambitious guy, or Judas, I should say. John and James could be pretty hot-headed guys. They got angry a lot. Simon was a zealot. He was a political zealot from the get-go. And Peter, well, you could always get Peter involved. So you guys get on the boat, and he sends them away with resistance and 12 baskets of leftovers. And as evening comes, they are rowing towards home, excited on the one hand that they'd seen the Lord do such great things, but disgruntled that they hadn't been around or been allowed by the Lord to stick around. They were going to have to learn that God's word sometimes goes against the crowds and against the will of the crowds, and you don't discover the will of God following carnal people. Well, with the disciples rowing towards Capernaum and the crowd scattered, Jesus then heads up to the hills to be left alone to pray. When we read here in verse 16, when evening came in John, his disciples went down to the sea. They got into the boat, went over to Capernaum. It was already dark. Jesus hadn't come. And then the sea arose because a great wind was blowing. And when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea, drawing near the boat. They were afraid. Now, the Sea of Galilee is roughly 6,700 feet below sea level. It is surrounded by mountains on every side except on the west. And on the west there is this rift valley, this tunnel almost, and that goes all the way to the Mediterranean. So when there are storms at sea on the Mediterranean, this rift valley becomes like a funnel to bring wind to the Sea of Galilee. And even in the recent last 25 years, there have been days when the Sea of Galilee has 12-foot waves on it, on a lake, imagine. And it comes out of nowhere. It's beautiful, it's sunny. 5 minutes later, disaster. Now, these guys were used to it. We actually were in Israel in 89 when it was the worst, I think, wind we'd ever experienced. We had our people out on the boat. We were doing a study on this very subject, and the water began to move, and it's usually real flat, and I'm not good at this. And it started we had 5-foot seas. So we went in, and we just dropped people off. We get to the dock, push them off. Next, wait for the thing to go back down, push them off. You know, like a Pez dispenser. It was ridiculous. So these guys were used to storms, but this was a particularly heavy-duty storm, and they now found themselves having to row against wind that had somehow kicked up. Well, they may have had an easy start at it, but they weren't making much progress now. In fact, in the middle of the night, they'd only gone halfway across. And they'd experienced this before. In Luke 8, the Lord had said, let's go over to Gadara. And they'd gotten in a boat, and the Lord had gone up to the front of the boat and went to sleep. He was tired. But in the middle of the ocean, or of the sea, it became like an ocean, water and waves and wind, so much so that it panicked fishermen, and they woke Jesus up, and they said, hey, you're sleeping? You don't care we're going to die? Jesus just went, really? You have little faith. And he calmed the seas, and they marveled. So they'd gone through this before, but he wasn't with them now. He was alone on the land. Mark tells us they were alone in the boat. John remembers it with great kind of vividness, even though it had happened 50 years earlier. And he's writing with just that recollection. Well, from what we can read in Mark and in John, it does seem like they left at evening, maybe 6 o'clock. But yet, the Lord will come to them, Mark 6:48, in the fourth watch, which means between 3 and 6 in the morning. So they might have been rowing 9 to 11 hours, 12 guys in a boat, and they were halfway across. So this was a pretty tough storm. And we read in Mark 6:48 that they were straining against the wind. The word means to be tortured or to be tormented. To their credit, they didn't turn around. The Lord had said, go, and they had gone. And I think he made it pretty clear he didn't want them there. But notice in verse 51 of Mark, or let's go to verse 49. When they saw him walking on the sea, and we read in verse 48, the fourth watch of the night, they supposed it was a ghost. They cried out. They saw him. They were troubled. Immediately he talked with them, said, be of good cheer. It's I, don't be afraid. And he went up into the boat to them. The wind ceased, and they were greatly amazed in themselves beyond measure and marveled. And then this verse 52. For they had not understood about the loaves, because their heart was hardened. In fact, up in verse 48, now about the fourth hour of the night, he came to them, he walked on the sea, and he would have passed by them, we read. So there's a spiritual lesson here, not just a story of a bad day out on the lake. The disciples neglected to remember what they had just learned on land, and that was, when you run out of energy and ability, make sure you look for Jesus. Was anyone looking for Jesus on the boat? No. Why? Well, they were fishermen, many of them. They could handle this, and they hadn't yet learned the lesson. So here's the spiritual corollary. The Lord uses these things to teach us to know him better. You've been in a storm, haven't you? Adversity or trial, hardship. We all know what it's like to have the winds blow contrary to what we're trying to do. Things get hard. I think it's why James chapter 1, verse 3 is such a hard verse. Count it all joy. Really? When you fall into the trials or the tribulations, the testing of your faith works patience, and nobody enjoys it. But if there's a purpose behind it, and that's James' point, then even if the trial goes on for quite some time, we can look to see what God might be wanting to do. So here in 8 verses, we have the storm survival guide. What is God doing with these men in 8 verses that they, in verse 52, conclude, well, they still hadn't learned the lesson? Let me give you 4 things that you might want to consider. Number 1, storms are unpredictable. The disciples had no clue what was about to happen. It came completely out of left field. They were on a spiritual high, man. They had fed 15,000 people, and they had started with nothing. They were miffed that the Lord had sent them away just as it was getting good. In the boat at their feet, 12 baskets of leftover from his last mighty work. We read in verse 18 here in John, the sea arose. The wind came up. The waves began to churn. And they were in it. They did well for a while, got about halfway across. Life was good, and then this happened. You ever made plans only to see the weather change? Your agenda goes out the window. When Paul was in his ministries and on his missionary journeys in Acts chapter 19, he is said to have been quoted as saying, after I've gotten through to Jerusalem, I want to go to Rome. He had plans to go to Rome. He didn't have any plans to go to Rome like he did, in handcuffs, headed for a trial that could cost him his life before Nero. The weather changed. Job was a man who was living a great life. He was prosperous, he was happy, he was a godly man, There were none like him. He prayed for his own children every day, even after they had moved out of their home. And yet one day his life absolutely changed. His 10 children were killed. His wife forsook the Lord. His health escaped him. And so did his friends. And he had to figure out where God was in all of that. Storms are unexpected. They come from nowhere. They're unpredictable. Your life rolls along, and out of nowhere you find out you have cancer and you may not get well. Or your child dies. Or your spouse is unfaithful. Or you lose your job. And immediately your plans change. Whatever you were thinking, that's not happening anymore. The train you had planned to board is no longer available. You show up at the train station and someone gives you another ticket. You're going here. I don't want to go there. Yeah, that's where you're going. And here are the disciples who needed to learn about the loaves at their feet. That he is not just God of the free lunch. He's also the God of the storm. So storms are unpredictable. Second of all, that God is in charge of the storm, and if you are following him, his desire is that you go through it. Now, we mentioned to you when we started that the boys were compelled by the Lord into the boat. You know, you hear people sometimes pushing a boat off the shore, and they say, well, shove off. I think that's what the Lord said to them, shove off. Get going, you're not staying here. They wanted to join the crowd in making Jesus king, but he knew better. And he got them going, Mark says, immediately. They were going right where God wanted them to be. They were right in the center of God's will. They weren't in trouble because they had forsaken him or refused him or ignored him. They were suffering now because they were right where he wanted them. He was the captain of their lives. They'd been captains of their own ship, some of them, for a long time. They owned a fishing business, a couple of them together. But they'd surrendered their life to the Lord. He was the captain. They were the crew. With all due respect, if you have a bumper sticker on your car that says, Jesus is my co-pilot, I just want to tell you he's not. You get in the back, he drives. There's no co-pilot with Jesus. I'm pretty sure he doesn't like that term. He's the captain. You're the crew. Get on and hang on. But it's important when you hit the storm that is so unpredictable, or the storm hits you, that you are living your life in the will of God so that you might know that it comes from his hand. He's allowed it. It's okay. He's got a purpose and a plan for it. He put them in the boat. He told them to go over to Capernaum or Bethsaida area. He sent them out into the storm knowing it was coming. God does that a lot in the Bible. Took the children of Israel out of Egypt. He had a couple of ways he could take them. He could take them north, head up. It would have been a lot quicker to get to the land of promise. They would have run into the Philistines, some bad boys in the desert, that they were hardly ready by faith to face at all. So what does the Lord do? He leads them south, sticks them in front of the Red Sea. Mountains on every side, Egyptians angry from the rear. And they complained about it. Oh, thanks a lot, Moses. Way to go on that strategy. That was wonderful. Way to put us in no man's land. But that's right where God wanted them to be. They needed to learn early on that he could do what no one else could do. And when there was no way out, he is the way out. So if you walk with God, though the storms are unpredictable, he is not. If you're there going through it, he's got a purpose for it. And if you know that, it will revolutionize the way that you live. It'll change the way that you approach life. The problem is, we don't want to learn that. The disciples on land hadn't learned it. Now at sea, forgot it. It didn't change them yet, and it needed to. Storms are unpredictable. God is in charge of the storm. In the storm, third point, God is with you. From what we read here, he knows what you're going through. He prays for you, and he will come to help you at his chosen time. Notice what it says here in verse 19 of John 6. It says they were 3 to 4 miles out. They'd only gone halfway across, and in those hours it was now a fearful time. Mark tells us in verse 48 that they were in agony and they were in pain, and they were rowing against the wind. And for every rowing stroke, they just were pushed back an equal amount. They were making no progress whatsoever. And yet, what does verse 47 of Mark 6 say? It says, when the evening came, the boat was in the middle of the sea. He was alone on the land, speaking of Jesus. And then you read these words, then he saw them straining at rowing. The Lord knew what they were going through. Now, we've been to Israel lots of times, and unless it is an absolutely clear day and the sun is out, there is no way you're seeing across that lake. 8 miles, all right, you can see the mountains, but you're hardly going to pick out a boat. The horizon just kind of slips away. Well, here it's not daytime, it's nighttime, and it's stormy. Jesus sees them because he's God. He knows every stroke of the paddle, every sore muscle, every anxious thought. He's well aware of what they are going through, but they don't see him. They can't. They can't barely see through the wind that is blowing and the rain that is falling and the waves that are pitching them one way and then the other. They weren't alone in the boat, but I'll bet they felt like it. And it's usually the way it works when we're in trials. You don't see the Lord, but don't think for a minute he doesn't see you. Job, in chapter 23 of his book, when he is in the midst of his great dilemmas and trials, wrote in verse 8, look, I looked forward, he's not there. I look backwards, I can't perceive him. When he works on the left, I can't behold him. When he turns to the right hand, I can't see him. But then he said, I know that he knows the way that I'm taking. And I know that when he has tested me, I'll come forth as gold. My foot has held fast to his steps. I haven't turned away from his ways. I've not departed from the commandments of his lips. I've treasured his words more necessary than my daily food. But if you ask me, do I see what he's doing? I have no clue what he's doing. I can't find him in this. I can't see him, but I know that he's there. In the storm, he is with us. And even though you can't see him, know for sure he sees you. He's aware of your struggle. The psalmist wrote in Psalm 56, Lord, you number my wanderings and put all of my tears in your bottle, and they are written in your book. So God doesn't just allow these things haphazardly. Even in your life, like the apostles, he has a plan. He wants you to know him better. Not only does he know, he prays. Over here again in verse 47, it says, or verse 46, that he departed to the mountain to pray. I've got to believe that part of Jesus' prayer was, Father, let these guys grow up. And may those baskets hit him in the legs often, remind them of the loaves. We're not so quick to learn, are we? Jesus prayed for them a lot. Towards the end of his earthly ministry before the cross, he prayed in John 17. And he said in verse 8, I've given them the words which you've given to me, and they've received them. And they surely know that I have come forth from you, and they've believed that you've sent me. I pray for them. I don't pray for those that are in the world, but for those you have given me, they're yours. I pray for them. In Hebrews chapter 7, it says that the Lord always lives to make intercession for us. And in Romans chapter 8, Paul writes, who is he that condemns if it is Christ who has died, yea, has rather risen again? He sits at the right hand of God making intercession for us. How does it make you feel to think that the Lord is right now sitting at the Father's right hand praying for you? I suspect his prayers get answered. Right? He's a pretty good prayer warrior. So the Lord is interceding for us. In every trial you face, in every situation you face, Jesus is talking to the Father for you. He knows what you're going through because he went through it firsthand. He can sympathize with all you face. We do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin, so we can boldly come before the throne of grace to obtain mercy, find grace, time of need. So, in the storm, he's with you. Do you see him? No, but he knows. And not only does he know, he is interceding for you that you might learn what you need to learn and get through it and have the strength to to overcome it. And in the storm, God is with us. He will also come in his time to deliver you. We read here in Mark 6 that it was in the fourth watch, verse 48, the fourth watch of the night. And John said they were in the middle of the lake. They'd gotten halfway across. So the Lord has been sitting in the mountains for 9 or 10 or 11 hours watching his 12 boys struggle to do as he's asked. He sees their pain. He knows they are exhausted, nearing wit's end. And at the proper time, he comes looking for them. When you go through it, do you ever wonder where God is? Lord, really? Do you know? Do you care? Will you help? And the answer is, yep. When? And unfortunately, it is usually about at the end, at the wit's end. The disciples no doubt would have favored him coming at 9 in the evening, or 10, or 11, or 12. It's now between 3 and 6 in the morning, and they haven't made much progress. Yet Jesus was in the storm with them. His eyes were on the boat, and so his eyes were on the men. His hands were on the waves. He controlled the dilemma. His heart was before the Father, so that they might learn to grow. And in time, he comes to help. God does this on purpose because he wants to break you of you so you can belong to him. So you can keep on track, so you can be kept from, like they would have had from those on shore, worldly intentions, so they could learn who he is and what he can do. Storms are always for your good, never for his, for yours. I think that the kindest people I've ever met were the folks who have gone through the deepest waters. But these disciples had gone from bad to worse. The conditions were dark. Their cries to God seemed to go unheeded. Job wrote in chapter 30 as he wrestled to make sense of his life, I cry to you, you don't answer me, and when I stand before you, you won't regard me. How can we suffer by forgetting and not considering what God has done in the past? That's what they did. So, in the fourth watch, he comes to them. One thing for sure, if you're God, you don't have to hurry because you're assured of victory. It isn't like the Lord goes, I better get in there before I lose them. No. He's going to win, isn't he? His delays are for our favor, so his hand is more evident, and our plans are thoroughly frustrated, and our self-will gives way to his will until we run out of energy rowing into the wind. Look, we all hate storms. I have never met anybody who likes trials. I know James says rejoice. That might be a perspective, but in experience, that's a hard perspective to maintain, isn't it? But I want you to notice that Jesus came walking on the very thing they feared the most, the wind and the waves. The footpath that he took into their lives was the very things they were struggling with. Their trials became his way in. Oftentimes, that's the way it works. We give God time when we need to, we must, we have to, we're done. I love what it says here in Mark chapter 6 and verse 48, where we read in the middle of verse 48, about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. He would have passed them by. Interesting. When they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed it was a ghost, and they cried out, and they saw him, and they were troubled. Crazy verse. I love it. Now you put yourself in the boat, the fierce winds, the waves dipping the boat, dark, then rising again. You don't see so good, you're tired. You see a figure on the horizon. There he is. Nope, now he's gone. I thought I saw hair blowing and garments flying. Nope, that can't be. Oh, there is something there. Ah! They were afraid, phobia. Their hair stood on end. Mark says they were troubled, they were agitated, their hearts were racing. And then you read that weird verse there in Mark, he would have passed by them, which suggests only one thing. They weren't looking for him. They caught a glimpse of him, But no one was looking for him. No one was seeking him. No one was crying out to him. Had they not just, oh, there he is, they wouldn't have seen him at all. The point is, even with the lesson on land of the loaves and the fish, here in another overwhelming situation, no one's looking for Jesus, which drives home the point there in verse 52 of Mark 6. They hadn't learned the lesson of the loaves. Yet, Jesus still comes to help because he wants them to grow. He still comes to help us, even when we're not so diligent looking for him. There's a great verse in Isaiah chapter 30, I think it's verse 18, that says, "Therefore the Lord will wait so that he may be gracious to you." And then it says, "Blessed are those who wait on the Lord." God will wait on you to learn to wait on him, but to wait on him. No one in this boat, 11 hours in, was looking around going, "God, where are you? Jesus, we need help." What did they do? They put their heads down, work a little harder, push a little more, and he might have gone by them had they not go, "Ah! There's a ghost or something over there. I think I've lost my mind." Well, verse 20 tells us here, he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." And they willingly received him then into the boat, and immediately the boat was at land where they were going. Fourth point is this: the storm will eventually end, and it will be glorious. Over the wind and the waves, they heard this familiar voice. "Really, dudes? No one's praying? It's me. Oh, it's Jesus. Don't be afraid. Cheer up. Why the long faces?" And how relieved were they when they saw Jesus in the midst of the storm? Verse 21 says, "Then they willingly received him into the boat." It's the first time that in their will they sought him. Now, John leaves off what you read in Matthew 14 about Peter. "If it's you, Lord, order me to come out there and walk on the water." And Peter took a few steps before he sank. John leaves it out because he's only interested in teaching us about the training of the apostles, the lesson for us. So he's very narrow in his focus. And besides, Matthew has already written about it. He doesn't. But I always wondered to myself, not back and forward in this book, in John 20, when Mary Magdalene comes to Peter and John where they were staying and said, "Hey, Jesus' tomb is empty." And they start off running for the tomb. John in chapter 20, verse 4 said, "We ran together," and then he said the other disciple outran Peter and came to the tomb first. I think there was some competition between the two. You're like, guys, maybe that's why he left this out. Peter can't be walking on the water in my gospel. I beat him to the grave. I have no idea, but something to think about and laugh. The important lessons in verse 21, it says, "Then they willingly received him." And I should just tell you, when it comes to storms, that's all the Lord's looking for. He wants you to willingly receive him on board, not put your head down and row, not look around, but look to him, because that's usually the problem. Trials oftentimes last far longer than they should because we never look to him. But one final miracle here in verse 21, we read that immediately the boat was at land where they were going. Matthew records that as well, that the folks on the boat said, "Well, truly, this is the Son of God." And they marveled and they wondered. And Mark says, yeah, that's because they still hadn't learned about them loaves. They still hadn't gotten it right. Look, trials are seasonal. They end. Here's the main lesson. Be smart. Get Jesus on board as quickly as possible. Psalm 37, verse 5. You commit your ways to the Lord. You trust in him. He'll bring it to pass. Pretty good lesson in 8 verses. Father, thank you this morning as we sit together for your word to us. Remind us again, Lord, that though trials are unpredictable, storms are certainly nothing we can plan, that you are the Lord of the storm. And if we will just learn to follow you in it and let you be the captain and we should be the crew, remind us that in the storm, even if we don't see you, you see us. You know our needs. You intercede for us with the Father, and you will come to help even though it seems like it's the last minute to us. May we learn, Father, that the storm will end. It'll be glorious, but we've got to learn to apply what we've learned in the past. Just like the loaves that were laying at the feet of these boys who just None of them decided prayer was necessary, even in the midst of this great storm. Yet at their feet lie the reminder, the clear reminder, that you had worked before, miraculously so. You could do the impossible. And if that's your plight this morning, you're facing some difficulty and trials that just seem to overwhelm you. Such a good day you came to church, where the Lord could just speak to you in the situation you find yourself and encourage you. That the storms might be unpredictable, but the God you serve is not. And he has purpose, and he knows, and he prays for you, and he'll intercede. He'll come to help. There's an end in sight. Just learn the miracle of the loaves. Learn that he's God. That when man fails, he doesn't. When man cannot, he can. Learn it quickly. Welcome him on board. Gladly receive him. Pastors will be up front after the service. If you need prayer this morning, come and lay those needs before him. And go your way with great joy. Rejoice in what you're facing. God is doing something wonderful. And he does all things well. Shall we stand?